Hey folks, Kostya here, and in today's video, I will be reviewing Rewire Your Chess Brain by International Master Cyrus Lakdawala. This is a new book released this year. Pretty big, hefty book. It's got about a little bit over 500 pages in here, and essentially this is a puzzle book. It's got a bunch of endgame studies in here, as well as a bunch of mating problems, things like mate in one, mate in twos, mate in threes. But these are not your regular mating problems. These are actually pretty tricky. Actually, full disclosure, before we go any further, Cyrus is a friend of mine. I've known him for many years. He's from Southern California and a very, very nice person. And in fact, we even had Cyrus on our talk show, Dojo Talks, where he discussed the book and his process for writing it and all that stuff. So if you'd like a little bit more of an in-depth preview to what's in the book, I'll leave a link to that in the description below, and you guys can check that out. But for the purposes of this review, I want to give you guys my full thoughts on the book. I've been spending the last several weeks or so just going through a lot of the puzzles in this book, as well as feeding a lot of the easier problems to some of my students just to see how they interact with the different exercises. Actually, here we have one of my favorite puzzles from the book. This is a puzzle by Kubel, composed in 1909, where it's white to play and win. If you guys want to take a crack at solving it while I talk. Now, the point of the book is to try to get every reader to at least attempt to solve every single problem. Even if you only spend something like 5 minutes, Cyrus's claim here is just that the process of trying to solve the exercise, even if it's a very difficult one, is still beneficial for you. So what that means is if you set up every single problem in this book, you spend a minimum of 5 minutes on each problem trying to figure out the solution. Even if you don't get any of them right, but then you review the solutions to each problem, that will still be greatly beneficial for your tactical vision and your tactical strength. Hence the title of the book, Rewire Your Chess Brain. And as far as the problems that Cyrus chose from this book, I would say a lot of them are well-known studies that if you've been solving studies for a while, you've probably come across these at some point. There's also quite a few pretty much unknown problems that I'd never seen before and was introduced for the first time in this book. So I really like the selection. I think Cyrus picks problems from a wide number of composers, and there is a wide range of difficulty, meaning a lot of players will find problems that they can solve in this book and a ton of problems that they will find challenging. So in general, the benefits of solving endgame studies and these tricky mate in two problems are pretty clear. They do a really good job of developing things like your imagination, your tactical vision. They really force you to be very resourceful because these puzzles are often very difficult, and because there's only one exact solution, it forces you to be very, very concrete and precise in your answer. But where there's definitely can be a little bit of discussion is at what point should one start solving endgame studies and how exactly they should be presented to the reader, which we'll definitely get into. So who is this book for? In my opinion, I think this book would be most useful for two categories of players. Number one, players who are at least 2,000 and up, that are ready to work on their own and put the hard work in and really try to improve their calculation and visualization. This is a great book if you're willing to put the time and the hours in solving, grinding at the chessboard. I think you'll definitely see benefits to your calculation and your overall tactical vision. I also think this book is good for coaches who want some more interesting problems to share with their students and really get their students to start thinking a little bit more indirectly and a little bit more creatively, especially looking for these unexpected solutions. And if you are a coach and you're working with players in the range of 15 or 1600, then there's quite a few problems in the book that you can feed to them and sort of guide them along while they solve. And I think that could be really beneficial. So I want to talk about some of the pros and cons of the book. I wouldn't say there were any major cons, just rather things I would have done differently. But before I do that, let me go over the solution to the puzzle on the board. So like I mentioned, this was puzzle with white to play and win. And when I first set this one up, I was at first intimidated because there were so few pieces. I felt like it might be quite tricky. But then as I started to think about it a little bit and started to break down what was happening here, realized actually that the limited amount of material, in fact, makes white's job pretty straightforward. So the first thing I noticed, of course, was that black's king and rook are cut off on the back rank. And if white moves this bishop basically anywhere, that would introduce a threat of rook ha check, skewering the king and rook, and winning the game. So this immediately gave me something to kind of latch onto and start to think about. And when you're trying to solve endgame studies, you're basically just trying to break down little details and bits about the position before coming to some kind of general conclusion and finding the solution. So I think my first thought here was probably just looking at the most direct move, bishop to e7 check. But once I noticed that black's king simply slides over to c8 and that rook h8 check would be met with king to b7, I immediately felt like, well, there's no way white is going to win here. The other important thing to understand about this position is that we have rook and bishop against rook with no pawns. Meaning if we get some kind of normal situation and black's rook is able to get off of the back rank, well then that's a theoretically drawn position and black should be holding that one just fine. So my next thought was something like bishop to d6, which to me seemed like might kind of mess with black's coordination a little bit. Then I thought about it and I saw this move rook to c8 black could play, and I just didn't see anything that white can do here. If we give a check on the back rank, black plays king to d7. If we play bishop e7 check, black will play king to e8, and then again, any check will lead to king to d7. If I don't give the check, then black's rook is getting out and black would be making an easy draw. So I kind of started to see the problem. If the rook gets off of the back rank, black is doing absolutely fine. And so the direction became very clear. Prevent black from getting the rook off of the back rank. And I thought about it for a little bit. I'd encourage you guys to pause the video if you'd like to keep thinking about it. And eventually I came up with the right move, bishop to c5. So this move comes with a couple of points. Number one, of course, it threatens rook h8, winning the rook, which means black has to react to this. They can't simply just push their pawn to a5, for example. The first move I checked here, I believe, was rook to c8. And here the idea was to give bishop to b6 check. King is forced to go to e8. And now probably the key move of the whole puzzle, bishop to c7. And it was this idea I kind of noticed when I started to realize that actually maybe I might be onto something and getting close. Because now the point is that black's king is stuck. The king goes to f8, the only square. We have rook h8 winning. And the rook is stuck as well. Rook has very few squares. Only safe square seems to be rook to a8. But then again, we have the same skewer with rook h8 check winning the rook. So with both pieces basically in zugzwang, this started to feel very promising. Black's only move seems to be a5. And of course, we still have to be a little bit careful here with white. If we took this pawn, then black would get out with the rook and again, be making a theoretical draw. Instead, white keeps the zugzwang and simply has to deal with this pawn. So I quickly figured out the solution here to the end. White simply approaches the pawn with the king. And eventually what we're trying to do is run black out of moves, because as soon as the pawn runs out of moves, we play king to a1 here. Now black is forced to move either the rook or the king. We have a very classic zugzwang, and white is winning the rook and the game. Of course, very important here that we don't take the pawn on a2, as this would allow black to give a check on a8 and then get the rook off of the back rank and save the game. Going back a couple moves to this position after bishop c5, black also had the option to go king to c8. And it's very important when you're solving studies to try to anticipate all of the possible defenses that the opponent can try. And here the key move is very similar to the main line, bishop a7. Once again, we use the coordination between the rook and the bishop to kind of freeze black's rook and king. Now the rook obviously has no moves, and the king again cannot make this move king to d8, as white would be winning with rook h8 check. Once again, black has to just try to jettison the a-pawn, but here white slowly, once again, runs black out of moves. In this case, we don't even have to worry about blockading the pawn. We can just take it, as black still has no moves, finally has to move the king, and white is winning the game. Our next puzzle here is, again, white to play and win. You guys can work on this one. And I basically just want to talk about some of the pros and cons of the book. So first, let's start with the pros. This is a good starter book for endgame studies. So if you've never solved endgame studies before, it's actually not a lot of great material out there for you. There's one book by Dvoretsky, Studies for Practical Players, that I think is quite advanced. And then there's a lot of individual books and collections of endgame studies by different composers. But the problem with typical endgame study books is they often come with very, very little direction. Essentially, it's just a book of problems. There's usually no description in terms of how difficult the problem is. And then the solutions themselves are often not very well annotated. It's just like a list of moves without any kind of like guidelines or explanations, just some variations that you're then asked to make sense of. But I would say that that kind of practice is only going to be really useful for strong players. I would say 2200 plus. Any lower than that, and you're probably going to suffer and struggle with a lot of the problems, then look up the solution and have a hard time interpreting what you're seeing. So the nice thing about Rewire Your Chess Brain is that the solutions are right under the problem. And once you're done, you can immediately go through it, and the solutions are often explained and annotated. So it's not just a list of engine lines, it's actually moves and explanations, things that can actually help you solve some of these problems in the future. So I'd say it has lots of good puzzles, especially if you're somewhere in the range of 2000 and up, 2200 and up, and you're really ready to take that next step in terms of working on your calculation. And like I mentioned before, it has tons and tons of good problems if you're a coach and you want to just curate and select specific problems to feed to your students of different levels. I think that might be one of the most efficient uses of this book. And with that, let's talk about some of the things that I personally would have done differently. Now, one thing that Cyrus did very intentionally about the book is that he really pretty much randomly mixed up the difficulty level of the problems. So the book starts off with a lot of the easier problems as a kind of like introduction and warm up. But then once you get into some of the main chapters, the problems really range in difficulty all the way from, let's say, 1500 to even grandmaster level. In my opinion, I don't think this was the best way to do things. Cyrus's point is that in a game, when you have some kind of tactical solution, you never know, number one, that the solution even exists, but number two, how hard it is. So you never really have a sense of like how difficult the win is going to be in your game. And Cyrus's idea is to try to recreate that in the book by not telling you how hard the problem is, just asking you to try to solve it anyway, spend your 5 to 15 minutes on it, and then once you go over the solution, you'll get some benefit, whether it was an easy or very, very difficult problem. And while I certainly understand Cyrus's point of view, and this is a point of view that a lot of coaches take, where you shouldn't really know the difficulty or the theme or anything about the puzzle, you should be just kind of thrown in head first and forced to figure it out on your own. I've always found it more enjoyable to go through books where the puzzles kind of get progressively more difficult. So you kind of start off with the easy ones, you build up your confidence, and then you slowly work your way up to the harder and more challenging stuff. And yeah, from my personal point of view, I've always felt like solving problems that are extremely challenging and way above your level is not going to be as beneficial as solving problems more appropriate to your level. So if it was up to me, I would have written this book with rating categories. I would have said, you know, if you're 1600, you should solve these problems. If you're 1800, you should solve these problems, and so on. So that's how I would have arranged the book. Now, the next thing I would change about the book is I would probably reduce the number of main in threes and main in four problems in the book. I felt like the main in twos are already so tricky and so challenging for the vast majority of players that amping it up to main in threes and main in fours, which become exponentially more challenging, honestly, it just felt like it was going to be too much for the majority of players. And personally, I don't really enjoy solving problems that I feel like I have very, very little chance of solving. Now, Cyrus, I believe, would again say that just the process, the attempt of solving some of these difficult problems and then going through the solutions will still be beneficial. And while I definitely wouldn't disagree that going through the solutions would be helpful, as someone who's, you know, solving and trying to improve their chess, I still don't want to work on these problems that are so like fantastical and that I feel like the solutions are just going to be like way above my head. And if I feel like they're above my head, then I can only imagine what it feels like for the majority of readers out there. So for a book that I think is going to be like a really good introductory book to endgame studies and a good starter book for someone that hasn't worked on endgame studies before, I would have removed a lot of the really impossible, you know, and insanely challenging problems in the book and replace those with just more accessible main in twos or in-game problems. But that said, it's not a huge gripe because, again, the book is pretty massive with over 500 pages. So if there are one or two chapters that you're not a fan of, it doesn't mean that you can't get a ton of value from the other sections. In particular, I really like the chapter titled Life Simulates Art, where Cyrus shows some games taken from real tournament games that had study-like solutions. I found those games quite interesting to play through. So let me show you guys the solution to this problem. Of course, if you want more time, you can pause the video, and then I'll give you guys my overall take on the book. So in this problem, once again, it's white to play and win. And what I liked about this one was that this is definitely the type of position I could expect to get in a real game. This could be a rook endgame that I find myself in. And if you're not paying attention and really trying to be precise here, it's very, very easy to overlook the solution. And now the most natural move in the position would definitely be just trying to see what happens if white pushes the pawn to c7, trying to promote it. Against this move, black would definitely have to play rook to c1, stopping the pawn from behind. So when I was solving this problem, I definitely looked at this move first. I saw rook to c1. I first noticed that this was a possibility, this move rook to h1, which would come with the idea of trying to distract black's rook from the c file. But the problem is that black would, of course, simply just take the pawn on c7. And if we try something like rook to d1 check, the king comes back to c5, rook c1 check, and the king can use the d6 square and defend the rook, and black seems fine. So I have, of course, some experience in solving these problems, and immediately once I saw this line, it sent off a trigger in my head that I could maybe switch something up and make it work. And going back to this position in my calculation, I realized, well, I can throw in this move d6, and this move, of course, defends the pawn on c7 and threatens to advance and promote on its own. Black is forced to take on d6. And now after rook to h1, rook takes c7, white gives rook d1 check. The king is forced to go to the c file, but now the king is no longer able to defend the rook from the skewer. So white plays rook c1 check, wins the rook, and wins the game. So a really cool trick, nice solution. And this is the kind of thinking that I think you can really develop once you start solving a lot of endgame studies. You first look at, let's say, the most direct solution. You try to make it work. You understand why exactly your line or your idea isn't working. In this case, rook h1, rook takes c7. The king was able to defend the rook. And then you look for alternatives along the way and you try to make your solution happen. In this case, we have to throw in this move d6, forcing black to take the pawn and eventually blocking the king's escape. So to wrap up, I think Rewire Your Chess Brain is definitely a really interesting book filled with a lot of classic and excellent examples of endgame studies. And if you're a strong player, again, wanting to take your calculation to the next level and willing to take the next step, then you'll get a lot of benefit just from setting up problems in the book, spending 5 up to 20 minutes on them, trying to solve them, and then reviewing the solution. If you're lower than this 2000 range, I think it would be quite an ambitious read for you. You might get some benefit out of it, but my opinion would be that your time would be better spent just working on your regular tactics and combinational solving. But even if you're someone that's not that high rated, but you're still interested in endgame studies and mating problems, then this is one of the most accessible books on endgame studies out there. And you can definitely find a ton of enjoyment out of simply setting up the problem on the board, playing through the solutions, and just kind of appreciating the aesthetic and beauty side of chess. All right, guys, hope you enjoyed this book review. If you have any questions on the book, or if you'd like to suggest any books for us to review in the future, please let us know in the comments below. Of course, a link to purchase the book will be available in the description. This is going to be an Amazon affiliate link, which means that it won't cost you any extra money to use that link, but it will give the dojo a little bit of support out of Amazon's pocket. So if you do end up purchasing the book, I'd appreciate it if you use the link. With that, hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and I'll catch you next time. Take care.